Friends, we want to welcome you. Thank you for coming today. We're glad to have our special guest with us today, Dr. Robert Miller, who spoke downtown last night to the crowd at the business school downtown. And so today he's here on Burnaby campus to talk to us about Aboriginal people and entrepreneurship, a really interesting topic. And so I'm just here to open up the proceedings and just to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam, on which shared territory the SFU campus is here at the Pacific Campus. So we want to acknowledge that. My given name in Cree is Running Fox, and in my language is Kawa. Means thanks to you. Hi. Thank you. A couple of free words for today. So before we kick off, I just wanted to do a really quick welcome song, honor song for our guest today. And it's from my friend and colleague, Gary George, who works in the Student Center here. He's kind of the author of the song, but I have his permission to use it in public sector. So here we go. Just for you, my friend.
Thank you.
So I have this card here. It's a Coast Salish flag. I'm trying to get those in the shop as much as we can. Be local, but it has SFU colors, as you know. It's red, black. We just want to present this gift to you.
Thank you very much.
Use it in a good way.
I appreciate that.
So.
Thank you.
So at this time, we want to follow up our
Well, thank you, William, and it's great to be here for the seventh and final lecture in the President's Dream Colloquium on Entrepreneurship. I won't recite what I've said before in any detail. I will say that this colloquium series, I think, has been a tremendous success, and I do want to thank the organizers for the time and commitment that they put in to organizing it. The whole idea of the President's Dream Colloquium was to try to pull people together, students, faculty, and staff with different disciplinary interests, but to focus on issues of common concern. And with the theme of entrepreneurship, we've seen and heard from people who have really helped us to do that in a number of different dimensions. And it's great for me to see. It's affirming for me to see that kind of engagement take place. And I hope that, you will come back for other President Dream Colloquia. In fact, I can tell you the two that will be coming up next year. Got to flip over here for a second. The first is going to be on obedience and disobedience, taking action on climate change. Should be very interesting. And another will be on protecting Indigenous cultural heritage, emergent policy and practice. But this is also, an opportunity for people to bring their interests to the table. There's some funding associated to bring in outstanding speakers like our speaker today to enrich the life of the community and to really encourage interdisciplinary dialogue, engagement, and understanding as part of our vision of an engaged university. I also want to say that I'm particularly pleased that this lecture on Indigenous economies is part of this series because, of course, as part of our strategic vision around the engaged university, we did, as an underlying principle, acknowledge our respect for Aboriginal peoples and cultures. And we're trying very hard as a university to be a positive force in terms of welcoming more students of Indigenous heritage to the university, making the university a more supportive and welcoming place for Indigenous peoples generally, using our research strengths. We recently have seen the formation of an Aboriginal Research Institute on the university. The Beatty School of Business recently launched the first executive MBA on Indigenous business issues. That's obviously a major step. And we're hoping to raise funds as part of our 50th anniversary campaign for a First Peoples House. And that First Peoples House would not only be there to support students and research, but we actually see it as having an accelerator incubator facility in which students and faculty could work on issues that are relevant to First Nations, and indeed there could be relationships with local First Nations in helping to build economies and develop economic opportunities. So I'm really pleased that this lecture is taking place and that we are privileged to be able to welcome as a guest lecturer Robert Miller to share with us his perspectives on this. I also want to say how grateful I am to the organizers of the President's Dream Colloquia. Their names, I don't know if their names are up there right now. They have been in the past anyways. Oh, Gladys forgot to put their names up. But Gladys is one of the people who supports them, and thanks to Gladys and the graduate's office as well. We also have some great sponsors who have helped to make this series possible. Not just the President's office, but others, and I had a list here, but they were also going to be on the screen. Here they are. BMO Bank of Montreal, BD Family Visiting Fellows Endowment Fund, the Office of Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Fellows, SFU Vancouver, and the President's Office have all combined to support this series. So with that, let's get on with the opportunity to hear from our speaker and from Brian Gallagher, a graduate student who's going to introduce our speaker today. Thanks for being here, and thank you to Robert Miller for lending of his time to this colloquium. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, President Petter, for those words, and thank you very much, William, for getting us started in a really good way, and thank you for the short but very nice song, so thanks very much. And the Office for Aboriginal Peoples and the Indigenous Research Institute are also co-hosting this event. So I'm Brian Gallagher. I'm a PhD student in Indigenous Entrepreneurship. I'm also an instructor in the President's Dream Colloquium, and I'm an instructor in the Aboriginal Executive MBA. So I teach entrepreneurship in that program as well. And I'm very delighted today to welcome Robert Miller. We had an event downtown last night where we had 40 of the leaders in the Indigenous business community and many students from our Aboriginal Executive MBA there, and it was a fantastic event. So many of us in the room had read Robert's works, but even though we knew a lot of his core ideas, he still blew us away. It was really passionate and engaged, and you guys are in for a real treat. Just before we get started, I'd just like to also thank people who made this possible. So Gladys Wee, the Dean of Graduate Studies, and also Elaine Lowe at the BD School of Business made this happen, as well as President Petter for making this whole idea of the Dream Colloquium a reality. And I think it's a really great initiative, along with our tech help at the back that's going to make sure everything goes smoothly. So thank you very much. So I'd just like to introduce Robert Miller to all of you. So Robert Miller is Professor of Law at the Sandra Day College School of Law at Arizona State University, and he's an enrolled citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. And he's an expert in American Indian economic development, American Indian natural resources, civil procedure, federal Indian law, American Indians, and international law. So these are his areas of expertise, and he's going to talk about Indigenous entrepreneurship today. So before being a professor, he was a practicing lawyer, and he also sits as the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals of the Grand Ronde Tribe. So he's very active in making judgments. And he was telling me about some of his judgments the other day, and some of them were about ticketing and being able to ticket people on reserve, etc. And he told me about one case, which was dog on reserve. Was one of the case names. So he sees a broad range of cases today, and he's the author of several books. Two of the most notable are Discovering Indigenous Lands, The Doctrine of Discovery in the English Colonies. And his second book is Reservation Capitalism, Economic Development in Indian Country. And this is one of the reasons we brought him here today. This book is fantastic. It really is going to be, I think, a classic in a few years in Indigenous economic development and entrepreneurship. And the book really resonated with our Aboriginal Executive MBA students that we have in the class. So many of his ideas really resonated with people and really spoke to the challenges and opportunities that exist around entrepreneurship. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Robert Miller here for a 45-minute lecture, and then we'll have a brief 10-minute discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions after that. So I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But thank you very much for coming, Robert, and doing this second talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all very much for being here, Mr. President. Thank you.
Gladys and William, thank you, everyone that was involved with inviting me here. And Brian's been a terrific host, and I've enjoyed last night's event. He said I'm a very dynamic speaker, and I hope that I'll be very exciting for you, too. I'm going to do my best to just wow you. I have to start my talk with the idea that I do not even pretend to be an expert in the law of the First Nations people here in Canada. So what I'm going to talk to you about is my experience in American Indian law. And so I'll be talking about the reservations in the United States, law in the United States, economic development in the United States. And so I'm going to need your active participation to analogize the issues to what you know about the First Nations people here in Canada and how the issues I'm going to talk about might resonate here. So when I was hired full-time as a professor in 1999 in Portland, Oregon, Lewis and Clark Law School, which is where I went as a student, the first thing I wanted to write about was economic development. My father owned his own business for 52 years. I had worked in his business for 19 years before I even went to college. And so I had this background of entrepreneurship. I knew enough about my own tribe. I knew enough about Indian tribes in the United States. The tribes were always viewed as being the entity to engage in economic activities. The United States has always properly dealt in government-to-government relationships with tribes. And so when the United States as a government has decided to support Indian economic development, it naturally turned to tribal governments. But wait a minute, governments running business doesn't quite sound like the American or the European or the Canadian or, our capitalist systems. Private sector, the private economy, the development of economy is what it sounds like we mostly focus on as creating economic development. So I was long interested in that. I had also been part of what's called ONABEN, I'll talk about it later, the Oregon Native American Business and Entrepreneurial Network, ONABEN. 4 Oregon tribes created ONABEN in 1991. It was a nonprofit organization, a 501c3 tax-free organization, and I had been on the board of ONABEN and was on the board for 12 years. So I was thinking a lot about, well, I didn't finish. These 4 tribes created ONABEN because they knew they needed a private sector on their reservations. They wanted someone to assist and help and train their individual tribal citizens to create businesses, and hopefully on the reservation if possible. So I had that background already, and so the first thing I wanted to write as a professor was about economic development. So the first summer after I'd been hired, I read a college textbook on economics, and now I'm an expert in economics. No, you said I was an expert in lots of things. Boy, watch that. I'm not an expert in anything. I'm a student just like all of you. We're just learning. So anyway, so with this ONABEN background, this is what I started to write about, and my focus then in this book that came out in 2012 is about reservation capitalism. I put quotes around the word capitalism because in the United States, if you use the word capitalism, some Native people, I have literally seen a physical reaction, a visceral reaction to the word capitalism. So there were 3 things I wanted to address when I started to write about this book. What is the true economic history of the American Indians? Were we some sort of socialist, communal communist? Was capitalism somehow anathema to American Indians? I wanted to examine what was occurring in the modern day for economic activities on the 300 reservations that are in the United States. And the primary thing I wanted to look at is business, is economic development somehow anti-Indian culture? I don't know about here, but you cannot talk about indigenous economic development in the United States without 3 or 4 questions at the end of your talk going, yeah, but that's anti-Indian culture to do that. So in the U.S. anyway, you do have to address this issue and take it head on. And I was going to mention this last night. I want to give you a quote of one of the famous leaders. He's passed away now, but he's the chief for 30 years of the Mississippi Choctaw tribe. And he was known for bringing economic activity to his reservation that was unheard of on most reservations. And he was given a talk at Harvard. And after talking about the glowing things that his tribe has done, what did I just tell you is the first question you get? Student goes, well, yeah, but what's this doing to your culture? And they said the question kind of caught him off, and he thinks a minute. He goes, well, I don't know, but in the past everyone moved away. Now everyone's moving home. So I want to give you that message, and that's what I'll deliver at the end. Of course, new economic activities, any kind of new stuff, has impacts, right? But if we can no longer afford to live on our reservations because we're too poor, because there's no housing, because there's no higher education, or even the grade in high schools are so worthless you don't want to raise your kids there, what's that do to Native culture? Do your kids learn their language when you're living in Vancouver or Portland? Do they get to participate in tribal ceremonies and interact with the leaders and the elders, etc.? So when we get back to that topic, I'll tell you that I think, of course, there's some impacts from any activity. But I think doing nothing is literally worse than working towards creating economies on our reservations. I think that that is what word did I use? I think I used a pretty strong word in my book, but I think that is not selling out, but injuring your own economy culture, by not making it possible for people to live on your reservation. Some of the tribes, the poorest tribes in the U.S. in North and South Dakota, while they've engaged in only minimal economic activity, it's already been proven to be a reason, an impetus for people to move home. And how can that not be a positive when there are living wage jobs and adequate housing where you can live on your reservation if you choose, of course? And that's what Chief Philip Martin was talking about when he was asked that question at Harvard. And his response, people used to move away. Now they're moving home. That can only be a positive. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about briefly today. I mean, this is my 1 hour and 15-minute talk, so I usually give, and so I have 40 minutes, Brian tells me, and he is a strict timekeeper. And then we do want to get to dinner, don't we? So I don't know if everyone's going to dinner, but I'm hungry already. So where did I start? I guess I'll get this thing, and I never know what's coming next. So I already, the PowerPoint is my, what do you call it, my outline. So where do I press? Right there. So what did I learn about American Indian? Now remember, I'm talking about American Indian, so you're going to have to contrast this with what you know about the Indigenous peoples of Canada. American, people in history books, etc., they think that Indian tribes own their land in common. I guess we do, right? So that analogy has been taken to that American Indians didn't know private property, didn't have private property. I would bet that 90% of Americans still believe that to this very day. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's false. And I literally think there was a colonial reason to think such a thing. Because I think that Euro-Americans that came to what's now the U.S., they wanted to assume that Indian peoples and cultures didn't own anything. And then their conscience was a little clearer when they took it all. George Washington, in 1783, our first president, if you don't know who George Washington, he was only a general then. The Congress asked him, after we won our revolution against England, they said, what should we do about the tribes that supported England in our recent war? Should we just take their lands and tell them they've been conquered? So George Washington writes a very important letter, I think, that is overlooked by most historians and overlooked by a lot of Indian law practitioners, etc. It was American Indian policy for 150 years. And what George wrote to Congress, he said, we don't have to fight tribes, we don't have to shed blood, we don't have to spend tax dollars on an army. He said, we will get what they have as soon as we need it. And I can now almost paraphrase. He compared Indians to wolves, to animals. To give George a break, I'll say he wasn't calling us animals, but if you could read it, and it's hard to say what he was really doing. But he says, what happens to the wolves of the forest as we expand our borders? He said, they disappear. And then, I can almost quote this, he said, it is the same with the savage, capital S, the savage as the wolf, capital W. So what was he telling our Congress at the time? We don't have to fight the tribes. We're going to get all their land. We're going to get all their assets. It'll just fall to us. Now, what's he thinking? Oh, American Manifest Destiny, if you know anything about that. God intended it. Was he thinking about social evolution, that American and Euro cultures were better than Native and Indigenous cultures? But that's what he wrote to Congress. And I literally think that was American Indian policy for 150 years or more. Native peoples will disappear. They're just weaker. They're going to die out. Social evolution. And Americans are going to take over the whole continent. Well, lo and behold, the tribes are still here, and the tribes are getting stronger. Population younger than the rest of America, and we're growing. Okay, that's my 1 hour and 15-minute version. Sorry, Brian. So, but there's where I was coming from, that yes, the United States used this, or I should say our early colonial leaders, wanted to assume that Indians didn't own anything. Lots of our presidents made comments. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, made this comment that Indian societies had the best governments of all. They had no laws at all. Well, that's kind of an ignorant statement. How can any society exist without law? If you know anything about indigenous communities, you know there were strict codes, codes of conduct, appropriate behavior, etc. And we're going to talk about there were definitely property rights regimes, and people owned things and worked hard to own and produce things to support themselves, their family, their clan, their larger tribe. So that's what I found out about this in the United States. I keep wanting to say the lower 48. I guess I feel like I'm in Alaska. I know I went north, and I'm from Arizona now. It is cold here. Anyway, so what did I find out? Well, you all know this already. Americans said the Indian wanders 1,000 miles of frontier and claims it for his own. That statement was made on the floor of the Congress by our second president. Indian nations and societies, and here in Canada, supported themselves for thousands of years through intelligent work that, dare I say, looks entrepreneurial. What were salmon fishermen? What were buffalo hunters? What were hunters of other animal species? What were the farmers? My tribe was known for the corn, beans, and squash. Everywhere we went, Chillicothe was our capital city, and there were hundreds of acres of corn. Were we nomads? Were we frolicking? Have I already made that joke? That we were like wood nymphs frolicking through the forest, living off the bounty. That's what Europeans wanted to think, so they thought, in good conscience, they weren't taking anything. Tribes knew their borders and their boundaries. They knew their hunting grounds. They fought to protect those. They sometimes fought each other to take them. They knew property rights. They knew, my own tribe, if you were out hunting, if you killed a deer or something, you'd leave an item of your clothing on it while you moved on to keep hunting. Finding honey trees, you put an item of your clothing on it, and then that tree would be, and the honey would be yours. Maple syrup for the tribes in more of the northwest, the U.S., they knew the property rights in those objects. Private property was nothing unknown to indigenous peoples. I studied Maine to California, Florida to Alaska in surveying the kind of property rights and individual property rights that American Indians enacted, and I'll bet it was similar here in Canada. I mean, the Montagnais, I don't know how to say that, the James Bay Cree, I even cited some examples of how they handled the fur trade. And the right to trap in certain rivers was owned by a particular tribe, a particular family. Other people didn't use that area without permission. Tribes here on Vancouver Island, which include the Makah, they're relatives of the Nacholniths. The Makah I studied very closely in northwest Washington. They carried private property rights to a very high extreme, even to honor what we today call intellectual property rights. Gosh, there's a whole area of the law called IP now, intellectual property. The Makah and the Nacholnith, they're relatives. You didn't use someone else's name. You didn't use someone else's totem symbol, their ceremonies, their songs. Just as you said, you used someone else's song and you gave credit for that. The Makah people and the Nacholniths had an idea of private property ownership of intellectual property. Things we call trademark and copyright today is what they were enforcing. So this is the kind of stuff that I learned. We supported ourselves. Of course, we didn't lay around and wait for food to fall in our mouth. We managed our environments. Maybe this is news to you, but many tribes in the U.S. used fire to control their environment. My own tribe, I'm just now involved in a grant. We're studying the Shawnee people. I literally, about 2 days ago, read how we used fire, to create the kind of grasslands that would attract the Eastland buffalo and deer, etc., to our areas. I've long ago seen proof of the domestication of wild plants, and even today they can study where these plants grow around what used to be village sites, and that native people were beginning to domesticate these crops. Do you know that corn has been grown in the Mississippi Valley continuously since 2500 BC? The ancient crops, the three sisters they're called, of corn, beans, and squash, made it to upstate New York by AD 1000. Most American Indians grew about 80% of their caloric intake. So they were not nomads just frolicking through the woods. And that's an image that has to be consigned, I think, to colonial type thinking. the dominance of one society over another, thinking somehow that they're better. But I think one reason we have to get away from this idea of thinking that economic development hurts our own culture is because maybe we don't know our own history well enough. And we don't know how our ancestors 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago supported themselves. They weren't sitting around for the federal government to send them money, were they? Now, there are Indian tribes in the U.S. that talk about treaty rights. Give us what you promised us. Give us what you owe us. That's true, absolutely, and hold the United States' feet to the fire. But as I ultimately say in the book, where has that gotten you? 200 years of waiting for the United States. American Indians, folks, are the lowest in economics in the United States in any identifiable racial or ethnic group. We have an average income per capita of half of African Americans in the United States. Educational attainment, life expectancy, health issues, we're in the bottom of all of those categories. So we need ourselves. That's what's happened from relying on the United States for 200 years, and that's also what has happened from being under domination and attempted genocide for 500 years. That's going to hurt you. It's going to impact you. So we're digging out of those kind of situations. But I guess my message is we got to do this for ourselves and stop relying on the United States, and let's look back at our own history and do it the way we always have. I have a quote of a chief from California in my book. He says, "It's not self-determination to have the United States take care of us." He says, "Self-sufficiency is self-determination." So that, I mean, I'm glad he gave me that quote because I already believed that, but it was nice to hear that from a tribal leader. What do you think Philip Martin was talking about? Our people used to move away. Now they move home because there was economic development and a place where people could make a living, an adequate living for their family. So what's next? Private and community property rights, I've been talking about that already. Even land. Now, folks, we always think of that native communities owned land in common. Well, that's true, sort of perceived as the tribal government, organization, or government as an entity owning it. But in every American Indian tribe that I studied, there were private property rights in land that were acquired by individuals and families that were protected, honored, even passed on through inheritance. California and Nevada regions, women would acquire the recognized ownership of berry patches, pinyon trees, acorn trees, and they slightly cultivate those things, kind of protect them from the deer and animals. They would leave those through inheritance, respected inheritance rights to their daughters. In the Pacific Northwest, where I grew up, salmon fishing, there was a lot of private property rights about salmon. Fishing rocks belonged to individuals and families, left to sons through inheritance principles. No one else would dare use that rock without the permission of the owners. So we understood and used private property rights, even the land. So where I live now, the Navajo people, the Hopi people, the other Pueblo peoples, even though the land that you lived on, again, was sort of considered communally owned, families, clans, and individuals acquired rights to specific pieces of property, sometimes by being assigned by the chief in charge of planting, sometimes by just whoever the general leadership of the tribe was. Among the Hopi, rocks put out around the borders of your land and no one else even planted next to your rock. So while the tribe itself was assumed to own the land and the community owned the land in common, you acquired private property rights in land. So I don't know if that's news to you or whatever. It pretty much was to me as I was studying it. So it gives a whole different view to the economic property regimes that American Indians operate under. And again, what I'm trying to reinforce is entrepreneurship today, working in a private business, even for your family's own profit-driven initiative perhaps, is not anti-culture. It's not anti-our history and our traditions. Trade networks across the United States, I'm certain it's the same in Canada, but shells from Baja California are found in burials 1,000 miles away. Pipestone from, I believe that's in Minnesota, is found in pipes and in burials across the United States. That when we only had the dog as a pack animal, European goods often reached native communities before the first European had ever showed up. The most famous explorers in American history, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, crossed the continent in 1803 to 1806. They were in North Dakota in the winter of 1804 to buy corn from the Mandan. They had their blacksmith making war tomahawks. And then they were trading them for the corn. Well, as they continued their voyage and crossed the Rocky Mountains in the summer of 1805, in the Nez Perce villages, there's a couple of these tomahawks were already there. So this native trade work was active. Indians understood the value of new goods, new technology. Today we call that smartphones. Back then it was metal pots and pans. Shirts, cloth, things like that, beads that were valuable. So we understood and we traded things like that. In Oregon, near my old home, Lewis and Clark ran across the Indian trading mart at the Dalles. And Lewis and Clark write in their journals, which again in American history are very famous. Maybe you don't even know who Lewis and Clark. I don't know the famous. Oh yes, I do. I know Simon Fraser. I know Alexander Mackenzie. I know what he painted on that rock at the coast. I know when James Cook came up our coast claiming this country. So I do know. I hope you do know about Lewis and Clark. Shame on you, because I know about yours. Okay, it just reminded me of that. Yeah, we do. We all know that, because we're all from the English colonies, aren't we? So where was I going with all that? I don't know. Oh, Lewis and Clark were stunned at the goods for sale in the Dalles. They bought 2 tons of dried salmon that then they took with them the rest of the way to the Oregon coast that they survived on for about a month or so. And they were stunned and they record in their, they said this is the great market for the native peoples. Selling things was nothing unusual for native peoples. Intellectual property rights, okay, let me set this up very quickly. Well, I'll go to the chart. So take a look at this, and I think I have a pointer here. So this is old information maybe, but this is developed by that organization that I was on the board of, Oregon Native American Business and Entrepreneurial Network. So this is just in Oregon. Per 1,000 Oregonians of the white Oregonians, 81 will own a business. We don't need to go any further. Look who's at the bottom. Out of every 1,000 Indian Oregonians, only 14 own their own business. So, you know, when I heard these numbers, when I learned about this, that's when I really started thinking about that's the missing component to economic development in Indian country. Everyone's thinking about tribal governments. All tribal governments in the United States are engaged in business to some degree or another and think they should be. Now, it's not unusual either. I'm not here to condemn tribal governments running business, folks. It's not the least bit unusual that a native government is involved in business more than a province up here is, or the government of Canada, or the states and the federal government of the United States are. Because tribes own the majority of the land and resources on reserves or in reservations. So they will be more intimately involved with economic development than perhaps states, etc. But what I am looking at is the absence of the private sector on reservations. And we'll talk in a minute the problem of that. This is old information, but I don't think it's changed that much. The United States Department of Commerce and the United States Department of the Census report these enormous increases in privately owned Indian businesses. I don't think anyone believes the numbers are correct. You'll have to buy my book to read about it, but I do explain why those numbers and the data the Department of Commerce gathered was so inaccurate you can't even believe the numbers. But what can we do about this then? I'm sure that's replicated in every state of the United States. What obstacles do natives face to developing their own business? And there's many, of course. What we might call human capital. What does that mean? That's the abilities you have to engage in business. Financial capital is the money you have to engage in business or to start a business. Native peoples in the United States lack both of those requirements. So maybe I should jump to human capital while I'm thinking about it. I thought I had a good slide up here that said something about that. We mentioned that Native peoples with educational attainment in the U.S. are at the lowest. Health issues in Indian country in the U.S. is at the highest. We have issues that we face. You know how Americans start their own private business? There's 3 primary ways Americans do, probably the same here. First, you put a mortgage on your home. You borrow the money from the bank by taking out a home equity loan, perhaps, mortgaging, risking your house. Second, an American uses accumulated family wealth. Borrow it from your uncle or your parents. Third, go get a bank signature loan. What's a bank signature loan? Well, that's where your credit history and your job history is so good that the bank will loan you $5,000 just to walk in, or 5,000 loonies, I guess, just for, signing a document. Now, are any of those 3 ways available to American Indians? The answer generally is no. An Indian that lives on the reservation, if they live on trust lands, they cannot give a mortgage to the bank, because the United States is the legal owner of lands that are held in trust. Reservation lands are held in trust, 56 million acres in the lower 48 states. 11 million acres of land are owned by individual Indians, but in trust in the lower 48 states. So that means the United States is the legal owner. The tribe or the Indian is only the beneficial owner. And you cannot give a mortgage to a bank on that property because the United States won't allow it. Second, how many native peoples in the United States have accumulated family wealth? Well, we've just talked about, we know what reservations are usually like, and we know that accumulated family wealth's not there. So American Indian can't use accumulated family wealth to start a business. My dad, I made this joke last night. My dad started his family business on accumulated family wealth. My mom's earnings in the shipyards during World War II. Both my parents came from very poor families in Oklahoma and Missouri. And my dad's off to the war, and my mom's welding and riveting ships. So when he came home, she had $3,000. He said, let's get married. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound very good. But anyway, that's where my dad's used car business got started. So where was I going? And so how many native people can walk in a bank and get a bank signature loan? If you don't have a solid work history, if you don't have a solid credit history, that bank loan is unavailable to you. So one of the main obstacles that American Indians face is, I call it credit, but it's getting that seed money to start your business, to take the risk to start your own business. So there are tribes in the United States, some that have accumulated some assets. They are thinking of this, and some tribes give seed loans, seed money for tribal citizens to start businesses. The Tohono tribe, which is just south of where I live now in Arizona, they literally were giving, I don't know if they still are, but they had a fund of up to $100,000 per person that they would give. So tribes aren't unaware of this. Obviously, diversify your economy. Tribes in the U.S. are aware of this. What's the number one way you can diversify it? Let's create a private sector. Why create a private sector? I'm jumping ahead. I really don't need the slide to move ahead, so let me just talk about it. There's only two economic principles that I'll talk to you about, folks, but that are relevant here. Leakage. Leakage is when money leaves your community too soon, sooner than is optimal. Most economists will say that a dollar should circulate in your community 5 to 7 times before it spins out. How long does money circulate on a reserve here in Canada? I know how long money circulates on reservations in the United States. Not at all. I worked pretty closely with the Northern Cheyenne tribe, which is in center Montana, for several years. And anyone that got a check of any kind at Northern Cheyenne, first off, there was no bank to even cash the check. There was no ATM on the reservation. So there was not even any way to get cash to spend it. So people would jump in their car and drive 42 miles to Hardin, Montana, the most racist city in Montana. Why would you want to spend your money in the most racist city in Montana? Or they'd drive 102 miles to Billings, which I do believe is the biggest city in Montana. That's where the money that Northern Cheyenne people got spent. That's called leakage. Every reservation is well aware of this. I have quotes from leaders of the Navajo Nation that 94 cents of every dollar received at Navajo leaves immediately. One tribal chairman said it's the border towns around Navajo that benefit from our money. So leakage is a big problem. What's leakage? You know, I'm an employer. I pay you to work for me. You pay your landlord rent. Your landlord pays the utility company. The utility company pays its employees. They go to the grocery store. They pay. That $1, if we can keep it in our, it's only $1, 1 loonie, but if we can just keep it in the community, now what that is what's called the multiplier effect. Turn that $1 into 8. Profit to you, rent to you, electric to you, etc., if we can just keep it in our community. Can tribal governments ever run all the kind of businesses we need to keep money in a reservation? Tribal government's going to run the laundromat, the secondhand clothing store, the gas station. On some reservations, they do run the gas station, right? Northern Cheyenne, they had a gas station. It was owned by the tribe. They had one little bitty grocery store owned by a non-Indian. So that was the economy at Northern Cheyenne for 5,000 people that lived on the reservation. So that and the Oregon reservations that I know the best, I saw these examples. So we need to keep money in Indian country. I have a quote from a federal official who said, if we invest $1 million in a non-Indian community, it produces $10 million in effect, the multiplier effect. He says if we invest $1 million on a reservation, it produces only $1 million of effect. So even from the United States view of investment, they're thinking about the multiplier effect. So how do we produce that in Indian country? I think it's the private sector. And tribes need to be thinking about that. They can't do everything. We can't expect them to do everything. They need the help of private entrepreneurs to create real economies on Indian country. So what is this? What issue do I have here? I already mentioned land into trust, getting approvals from the United States. But I'm talking about tribal approvals for leases to operate a business in Indian country. Regrettably, the tribes in the United States, there are plenty of examples that you can't hardly get a lease to operate a business. I'm mentioning a tribe in northern Arizona that I don't want to name, except it's the Navajo Nation. I have read that it takes 20 separate bureaucratic administrative steps to get a land lease, and you have to put 1 year's lease up. Now, what entrepreneur has enough cash trying to start their new business so that they can put up 1 year lease? So here's a tribe that, now maybe this has changed because where I read this was a book a couple years old. I hope it's changed because instead of helping entrepreneurs to locate on your reservation, you're making it nearly impossible. So where is a Navajo entrepreneur going to locate? They're going to move to Phoenix, where there's 5 million people and you can get a lease to a building tomorrow. So this is the kind of thing, the Harvard Project. Now, you had Stephen Cornell speak here, is that correct? So you've heard some of the findings of the Harvard Project on American Indian Development. Obviously, the leading, except for me, the leading, that was a joke, folks, because I don't qualify as compared to Harvard. But the leading study now for several decades of economic development in Indian country. And they talk about some of these various things I'm talking about, even though they're approaching it from the tribal government aspect. I'm approaching it from the private entity entrepreneur aspect. But a lot of the rules apply the same way. You have to have efficient bureaucracies if business and investors will even consider locating in your location. So even for attracting our own citizens, tribes have to be business friendly if that's what they choose to do. That's a government and a community choice, isn't it? I'm not trying to force anything on anyone, but this is a new way to think of economic development if you want to perpetuate your reservation as a place where your people can live. There's got to be adequate living wage jobs and adequate housing. On most reservations in the United States, folks, and I imagine it's true here, the housing that gets built is low-income housing for the poorest people in your tribe. What about the brain drain? I'm sure you all know what the brain drain means. If your middle-class families can't live on your reservation, they're going to live in Phoenix, or they're going to live in Vancouver. What does that do to culture? How does that help the community, the tribal community, can improve itself and perpetuate itself and continue? So I think it's as a basic an argument as that. We mentioned credit, tribal courts, tribal bureaucracies I was just talking about, but even tribal courts. Don't forget when an entrepreneur, even a Shawnee entrepreneur is thinking about locating on the Shawnee reservation, I'm going to compare that against the nearest town, aren't I? And I'm going to go, where do I have the best chance to succeed? 10 minutes, I'm on slide 2, Brian. You do this to me every night. 10 minutes, well then okay, I'm going to move ahead. We'll jump some of this stuff. Now, this is a bit of what we call human capital. Indian entrepreneurs have not had the experience, have not had the job history. Just for example, I don't know what the situation is in this country with banks on reservations, but I already mentioned the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, a very big reservation, not one single bank. There's a study, Department of Treasury, United States, 2001, that said 86% of Indian reservations did not have a bank on it. 1/6 of Indians had to drive 100 miles to find a bank in 2001. Something like 87% of American Indians had never had a checking account. Well, obviously there was no bank you're dealing with. So you think an Indian person's ready to have a business checking account, know how to reconcile that and run those? So we have a financial literacy shortfall in a lot of our societies. So Onabin was involved with trying to improve financial literacy. A few other nonprofit corporations that tribes have helped create are working very diligently, starting very young in grade schools in South Dakota to teach financial literacy to American Indians. So these are the human capital issues we're talking about. Are you prepared to and capable of being an entrepreneur and running your own business? So I'm going to go with 10 minutes. I've already talked about some of these things. The role of tribal governments is crucial in entrepreneurship. I've already mentioned you have to have, well, I sort of blew past it. You've got to have bureaucracies that function, that help businesses locate on res. You have to have a tribal court that is independent and unbiased. The Harvard Project also says, I have a quote from Joseph Kalt, the Cornell and Kalt are the Harvard Project, and Joseph Kalt says, without an independent judiciary, small business has no chance. Put yourself in the shoes of an entrepreneur. You're going to open on your reserve, or you're going to go to Vancouver. There's 3 million, I don't know what it is, 2 million people in Vancouver. Boy, there's your market. But I'd sort of like to open on the reserve, but what's the drawbacks? The chief doesn't like me too much. And the judge is the brother of the chief. I mean, anyone doing due diligence thinks about things like these. You aren't doing your due diligence if you don't know the law of the jurisdiction where you're thinking of going. Does my reserve have laws about commercial dealings? Is there a bank? All of these things are simple questions that an entrepreneur is going to ask. Guess I'll locate in downtown Vancouver. Your reserve just lost without even knowing about it. And forget about even Indian entrepreneurs. A big company thinking of investing somewhere asks these same kind of questions. What's the law on that reserve for non-Indians, for non-First Nations people? Will that court be fair to me? Same thing we asked before we go to Russia, right? You want to open a business in Russia? Nobody wants to open a business in Russia now. Community cohesion, family stability, what does that mean? If people can live on the reservation, if they don't have to move away for education, if they don't have to move away for health care, if they don't have to move away for a house you and I want to live in, if they don't have to move away for a living wage job, how that benefits culture. I think it's a non-brainer. What did Chief Philip Martin say? Everybody used to move away. Now they're moving home. That's the Harvard Project. Governance, stability in the law, separation of politics from business management. These are the findings of the Harvard Project about tribal economic development. But they absolutely apply across the board to entrepreneurs being able to successfully work in your territory. This is a quote from Navajo chairman. Poverty is not a cultural trait of ours. We demand you work hard to support yourself so that you're able to help others. The chairman of the Oneida tribe in upstate New York, he made a little joke. He said, yeah, we tried poverty for 200 years, so we decided to try something else. How's poverty working out for you? Not well. Oh, I forgot to mention this last night. The Eastern Band Cherokee, who are in the state of North Carolina, have had a fairly successful casino for a while now. The Duke Medical School studied the mental health of Eastern Cherokee children in 2003 and found that the health was much improved of the children from a few decades before. Now that was because of a little bit of money, a little bit of employment that the Eastern Cherokee Band people were getting. That study has been continued, and the New York Times reported on it again just barely about 2 months ago. And this woman, doctor at Duke Medical Center, the statistics continue to prove the health of the children are improving. And it can only be tied to just a little better food, a little better housing, and a little economic development. Have I convinced you guys yet that this can only help culture? I'm going to beat you over the head with it until you agree with me. So just raise your hand now, and the talk can be over, and we can go eat. Now here's an important role for tribal governments. Be the clients of Indian-owned businesses. In the United States, the gaming business has been in a boom for quite a few tribes. The gaming industry now, the gross revenue in the United States is $27 billion a year. Tribal gaming. But as is talked about at every conference, these tribes do not spend their monies on Indian-owned businesses. They know they're not doing enough. They admit it. Now, they would say, well, there's not enough Indian businesses. It's a chicken and egg thing. Oh, we'd hire them if they were here. Well, I have a feeling if you announce that you will hire them, that entrepreneurs will come out of the woodwork. What is an entrepreneur? It's someone who has some kind of a new idea, a twist on something else, and is willing to take a risk at it. So if tribes were to adopt Buy Indian Acts, which the federal government in the United States has one that has not been used by the federal government very much, I think their entrepreneurs would follow. I've mentioned Onabin. There's the pointer. The Lakota Fund operates on the Pine Ridge Reservation and serves the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, the two poorest reservations in all the United States. And the Four Bands Community Fund is on the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe Reservation. Studies have proven all three of these organizations have had a significant monetary impact and improving economic conditions on their local reservations. The Four Bands Community Fund has done a fabulous job and is now serving and making loans to entrepreneurs on all reservations in South Dakota. They have a very interesting study I just used in my class, comparing the Cheyenne River Sioux economy to another tribe to try to show what we're missing and what business potential there is at the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. So if you're interested in that, I mean, the study's online. They did that in 2012. Very interesting to see the businesses that were thriving on another reservation that were completely absent at Cheyenne River. So the Four Bands Community Fund, through financial literacy, is trying to teach Cheyenne River Sioux entrepreneurs, here's a business opportunity you can pursue. Look at, here's the proof of it operated and has functioned fine elsewhere. We already talked about that, so I think this, well, I won't show that. So I guess I'm at my end. So I was supposed to talk about how this has something to do with sovereignty, right? What is sovereignty? It's a word we throw around the United States left and right. I'm not sure some people know even what they mean by the word. So in my class, I give a rule of thumb. Sovereignty is when a political body exercises power, that's jurisdiction, over a defined territory and over all the people that come there. I mean, I'm now subject to this province, right, and to Canada, because I voluntarily came here. Do tribes and do the reserves exercise that kind of sovereignty? What helps that? There's political sovereignty, and there's de facto real sovereignty, too. De facto real sovereignty is when you're hiring other people to work for you, I think. That's what Philip Martin said. I mentioned the Mississippi Choctaw Tribe. They're one of the top 10 employers in the state of Mississippi now, and have been for way over a decade and a half. Do you think that gives that tribe political influence? Do you think the senators from Mississippi listen when Philip Martin calls them on the phone? Yes, they absolutely. Well, I said he passed away, so I won't make a joke. I was going to say they'd take his call now, but okay, that was supposed to be a joke, sorry. Anyway, so where was I headed? Sovereignty. Sovereignty is power. Sovereignty is influence, and there's no way that, sovereignty is very much connected to economic development, both tribal and individual. And again, I tie it more back to culture. How are we going to exist that next 7 generations? How can we think down the road that 7 generations? How can we take care of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren if we are so poor, so uneducated, and we can't even take care of ourselves? So, my final message, I guess, is that I'm not thinking of how to make a next Donald Trump Indian, right, or make some individual Indians rich. I'm talking about enriching our communities so that we can survive as we wish for that next 7 generations. So that's what I see in economic development. That's why I've been writing about this and thinking about this, and that's what I've been advocating for tribes to do. So I guess I'll stop there. Well, thank you very much for attending.
Robert, thank you very much for another impassioned and I think hopefully convincing speech. He gave one last night too, and it was equally as convincing today. So what I'd like us to do is to develop some questions for Robert, and how I'd like for us to do that is to just talk with one another for 5 to 10 minutes. So to talk about what surprised you about what Robert said. What did you hear that you haven't heard before? What confirmed what you thought? And then to develop a few questions that you'd like to have him answer. So what I'd like you to do is mix up a little bit. I know we have quite a bit of the Dream Colloquium students kind of in one section, but I'd like you to kind of mix with each other just for 5 or 10 minutes, introduce yourselves to one another, talk about what interested you, what you found surprising, develop a few questions, and then we'll get Robert to do his best to answer them. Does that sound okay? Great. All right, 5 to 10 minutes then. So I know everybody has questions because you've just been talking and developing them. So it's just a matter of whose question first. Whose question first? And we'll try, Robert doesn't talk too long when he answers questions, so we'll try to get through a lot of them. So who's got the first question? Yes? Oh, actually, what we should do is...
Wait for the microphone, please.
This is for the digital, we're recording the video, and there's some people watching this digitally, so just...
Okay. That means I'm going to have to actually
Yes, the whole
frame
world
this
is your
properly.
audience.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you had this down as a potential or a barrier, but you talked about the development of human capital, and that to me is one of the really interesting areas about. And so I'm curious if you have any insights on what has to happen. Is this something you're starting with that needs to be started with the youth? Other than waiting for a generation of people to grow up, because I don't think we have a generation. Have you had any thoughts about how we can accelerate that process?
Well, the Onabin organization that I mentioned, they've been around since '91. They teach classes, 12-week courses. You meet once a night, 3 hours, and the goal at the end is for the students to have drafted a business plan that a bank that could be funded. So this is to, sort of ferret out the entrepreneurs, and so the tribes will advertise these classes are being offered, and Onabin has taught those at Oregon, Washington, and Idaho tribes, and produced several hundred new businesses that have a very good retention rate. So even that basic class has started. The Onabin materials are online and can be purchased. A lot of tribal colleges in the United States and other tribes have used, and these are cultural specific, drafted by Native peoples. The board of Onabin are natives. The 4 Bands Community Fund that I mentioned, they have materials online. I think they do. They're the ones that are doing financial literacy starting in the schools on the Cheyenne River Sioux-Res. And there are other materials that can be found for financial literacy. So yes, there's a way we can help the generation right now. I mean, this is something that you look for tribal government to do, right? The Small Business Administration in the United States, this is its whole goal really is to help the private business owners in the United States, and the SBA, Small Business Administration, has also focused on Native businesses. So there are some programs that way. I imagine there might be programs here through the Canadian government, through the province, that the First Nations here could utilize. This is the kind of thing where tribal leadership is still required and involved, because it takes a tribe to contract with Onabin to do the kind of work that we have done in the past. It takes a tribe to start the 4 Bands Community Fund and the Lakota Fund. So it takes leadership. Entrepreneurs have the ability, or maybe don't even know they want to be an entrepreneur yet. So we need leadership, and this is the role for tribal government, even in the private sector.
To ask is, what about mentoring and sponsorship? Having successful business people in the reserves sponsor or champion younger people to become entrepreneurs.
That's a very important point that, again, is lacking in much of Indian country. Like my dad owned his own business. You just grow up thinking that's a natural thing you can do if you choose. In Indian country, who are the mentors? Where's the example? Well, there are almost none, so we're starting almost from zero. But what's advised by the Harvard Project, and they practice what they preach. They have given these Honoring Nations Awards since about 1995. I mean, Onabin won one of their awards in 2005, so they want to promote the tribal programs that have had an impact. And they say that mentors should be honored by their tribal communities. I think, didn't you tell me there's a Native Chamber of Commerce right here? And they work together and promote each other. There are, in most states in the U.S., there are Indian Chambers of Commerce. So again, those first couple of meetings, there's 2 people show up, right? I know a guy that was on the board of Onabin with me. He had a very successful HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. He was doing $5 million contracts, and he mentored a young Native guy, literally hired the guy later. And so there is this program, but it's all in its infancy. Like you said, this is almost, It's an old idea that we forgot for a few hundred years, and it needs to be restored. So you need that mentor. You need that. Where can a kid get their first job? You know, there's no paper route on most reserves or reservations. Where it is the McDonald's you work in. How do you learn to make change, right? You know, it's just all these simple things that are human capital. So tribal governments again, native chambers of commerce can be the place those mentors meet with people and mentor them.
Oh, on that same train of thought, what is your thinking about non-Indians on reserves?
That was asked that last night. We need everything. I'm not against a non-native opening a business on the reserve. Who are they going to hire? Where's that money? Where does it help to get multiplied and get circulated? So, you know, of course it'd be greater if it's a band member, right? But if it's an Indian of another tribe, if it's a non-Indian, I really don't care. So I think ultimately in my book, you know, again, because I've been a little criticized a time or two for using the word capitalism, and so I sort of conclude the book with capitalism, socialism, communism, free market entrepreneurship. I say, call it whatever you want, we need it. That's, I think, how I end my book. So I'm not against that at all. You know, and in fact, that's if a non-native wanted to open on a reserve, that shows you've got a court system they trust, a government they trust, employ a trained workforce they think they can use, and a market they can access. That would sound like positives.
Hi. In our group, just a couple people talked, myself and Dennis, but everyone else was great about participating. Anyway, it's just my question is really about Indigenous entrepreneurship. Is there anything different about it than any other entrepreneurship? Because the way I'm hearing you frame it is basically any Indian-owned business, anything that's owned by an American Indian, whether it be tribe or individual or family or whatever, starting a business, earning an income is Indigenous entrepreneurship. But some Indigenous people that I'm aware of are trying to do something a little different. They're trying to kind of straddle some traditional, well, maybe some values that they have and do something capitalistic, but that still, for example, protects their natural environment and land being often fundamental to identity of an Indigenous person. And I'm not trying to romanticize, but I mean, when people live thousands of years in the same place, they have a different attitude towards sustaining the natural environment, for example, of that place. So, you know, does that come into your thinking at all? What is there something different or potentially different? Or also, what about the idea of trying to create common benefit, some kind of larger benefit for a group as opposed to only your own personal profit? I've heard that's also perhaps a different dimension of Indigenous entrepreneurship.
Yes. I mean, that's one of the things that's attacked about capitalism, right? Because the one owner is thinking about maximizing their profit, and they'll do almost anything just as long as the law allows it. So spill garbage into the ocean, spill pollution into the air. The tragedy of the commons, let someone else pay to clean up. So capitalism has that issue. There's a book chapter I would like to suggest to you folks, not written by me, doggone it, but it was written by Ronald L. Trosper, and he was literally studying the Nisga'a people, which I guess are north of here. And he was teaching at a school up here at the time. He's a Harvard-trained economist, Salish and Kootenai Indian from Montana, teaches now at University of Arizona. So I had him speak at my conference because I wanted him to talk about this chapter, and I used the chapter in a class I'm teaching now. How the salmon were managed and increased. And here was a commons. There was no tragedy because these native peoples had a property rights regime that protected the commons, not the capitalism idea of rape it for anything you can get out of it, right? So, and that's what the potlatch system was a little bit about. I knew only a little bit about the potlatch. He writes quite a bit about it. In chapter number 1 of his book, you ought to read it. It's worth seeing. So the whole idea was manage your salmon for its health, because that will ensure your health. But if there's a down year of fishing here, then potlatch with your neighbors up the way, and they'll feed you. And a couple years from now, when their salmon run's not so good, you'll feed them. So it was a communal, mandated cooperation, if you want to call it. Share the commons, protect the commons. Don't have the tragedy of the commons. That's his book's called that. It's called something reciprocity. He's got like 3 R's in it, so I don't know the whole title, but read chapter 1, because here and for 1,000 years. And folks, they didn't just keep from destroying the salmon. His argument is that they increased the salmon runs. So they knew how to manage it in a positive way, even though they were feasting off it. Absolutely. And so there's a bigger goal to it. Hire your own family, hire your own relatives, support your family, support your community, support your reservation. So there is maybe a higher and better goal to it. So let me give an example. And also, so culture comes into it, right? You're not going to open a business X on a reservation that their culture in 1,000 years is they hate X. I mean, here's an example I give. I mean, opening a hog farm in Israel is probably not going to be the most profitable business, right? Now, I don't think it's impolite of me, or it's not even wrong to say that. I mean, there's a religious/cultural ban on eating pork, right? So don't open a hog farm. So there are no doubt some reserves and some reservations that ecotourism might not be popular on a reservation that doesn't want to invite a lot of strangers there. But ecotourism might be a wonderful business for quite a few reservations. A couple tribes in Arizona have world record hunting and fishing that they've developed on their reservation. They make a lot of money off it. Now, I guess that's not ecotourism, but it's tourism. So this society, they're fine with that. Pardon? That's a different tourism. Okay? Oh, he's got the microphone right there.
Sure. It's okay? On? No. Well, everybody had a question formulated in our little group, but I'll just start anyway. And you mentioned a leader, an expert, who talked about people going back to the reserve in the United States. Here in Canada, it's a bit different. From the 60s onward, there's been exodus from the reserve, and it's continuing today. So over half of the First Nations people in our country now live in urban areas or small towns. So I'm just kind of wondering what draws people back to the reserve. Is there opportunities there in the States now? What's the situation? And the second half of that question is the cultural part. You talked about people being afraid of losing their culture if they pursue entrepreneurship and live in urban areas and things like that. But I kind of find it different here in Canada, that we have such an intermingling of cultures here, that we're all kind of learning from each other. Native First Nations people, Métis people, Inuit people today have a lot of political power in this country. There's a lot of ways to develop pride in culture, and so what's happening is the intermingling of cultures and learning from each other, adapting other people's culture. We're talking about First Nations people here. So I'm Cree with my background, and that's Plains, but I've grown up West Coast, so I kind of follow West Coast First Nations traditions, and that happens a lot out here. So, and I don't view that as a bad thing. I've seen that as a good thing out here. So I'm just wondering, that's the other part of the question, I guess, is what's the situation with regards to that in the States?
In the United States, about 65% of Indians live off of reservations, so it's even more bad, is that a word? Worse than perhaps it is here. Why? Well, education, job, housing. People are drawn to move back home, so you have this movement back and forth often. I mean, where you're born, you always think that's the best place, right? So you're drawn home for ceremony, for family, etc. And so I think if Native people could live on their reserve or reservation, I think a lot would. So I mentioned the Umatilla tribe, the tribes in North and South Dakota with a little bit of jobs for... In fact, there was a headline in New York Times, folks. The census of 2000 showed that white people were leaving North and South Dakota, but the headline says, Indians and the buffalo reclaiming the plains. I mean, it almost sounded like a racist headline. But Indians were moving home to their reservations, and we know buffalo herds are being developed by tribes, etc. So it's kind of funny that rural areas in North and South Dakota are not supporting anyone anymore. White people were leaving. Indians were coming home if they could. So I mean, that's got to be a positive boon. So I don't know if that kind of addressed your question. I think in the U.S. we may not have the kind of mingling of cultures that you're having here. Indian culture doesn't seem to have the impact down there. So it's up to tribes and tribal communities to develop their own to perpetuate and even develop. So let me tell you one plus side that also takes money, right? Who creates the art in any civilization? You have the working class that produces the food. It's someone with leisure that has the time to study the stars, to build the pyramids, to build the American pyramids. You ever heard of the American pyramids? Cahokia, Poverty Point? No one teaches that. This sort of goes back to my George Washington thing. We don't want to believe that the ancestors of the modern-day American Indian knew how to build pyramids every bit as fancy. They're wooden, they're dirt, excuse me. But the biggest Indian mound in America is 8 miles from St. Louis, Missouri. So it's not in some remote, strange place. How many of you have heard of Cahokia? It's a it's a United Nations, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and there are 300 mounds on the place. But the biggest one is bigger than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. Cahokia had 40 to 50,000 people in it around 1250 AD. They had a wooden Stonehenge out front that did the same thing as the Stonehenge in England did. It was a calendar. These earthen mounds are built geometrically aligned with the stars, just like the Mexican pyramids, where, on the equinox, it's perfectly aligned. Now, we all studied the Mexican pyramids, didn't we? You know, I bet, about the Egyptian ones. Apparently, one person and me know about the American one. Wow. Now, I forget why I got off onto that, but why did I get off onto that? Oh, okay, this kind of stuff's not taught, but at one time we had cultures that had the time and the talent to develop that stuff. How do you do that now? You need your Galileos and your Newtons and your Beethovens. They've got to have time to sit at home and make music and be scientific geniuses. And so what I was enthralled and happy with this Lewis and Clark expedition, the United States made money available for tribes to do programs they wanted. And there are 4 books that came out of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Tribes didn't care one whit about Lewis and Clark. They didn't write about them. They wrote their own history. My tribe right now is taking up a $1.3 million federal grant, and we're going to study our history from 1812 to 1945, a very kind of vague period that's not covered much. We can develop, so this gets to a cultural question, right? You develop and perpetuate your own culture by studying it and understanding it, and who better to understand it than your own people, your own PhDs. Don't rely on that white anthropologist who comes to the reservation, wants to get tenure and wants to get published. Get somebody that does something for your community. So I and my daughter has a master's in history. I'm in law. We're on this little committee that is studying and going to write a couple books about our tribe's history. We're going to Washington, D.C. to the National Archives in a couple weeks. And I'm doing the treaty and law side of it, being a lawyer. So, there's positives that come from this. It takes leisure. Do you know the American Indians used to have lots of leisure time? Do you know what your economic year is? Now, I didn't mention this other very simple economics point. Your economic year is how long you have to work to support yourself. Most of the Americans' economic year is 50 weeks because we only get 2 darn weeks of vacation. Now, I know you guys up here get what, 6 months of vacation? What do you guys get? Do you know that most Native people only had to work 3 or 4 months to earn their economic year? What'd they do in their spare time? Ceremony, artifacts, arts and crafts, etc. So that's what I think and hope with money we can study ourselves.
I just have a question about a lot of what you're talking about there. It looks sort of like in universities they call it indigeneity, but in the rural communities or the tribes or up here in First Nations, we call it Indigenous knowledge systems. How do you go about protecting that within the realm of sovereignty? For instance, here in Canada, we have the impediment of the Indian Act, and that's always there. That's continually imposing our exercising of our sovereignty.
Again, now for Canada, I can't comment because I just don't know the law well enough here. 2 students, a professor and a student that met with me yesterday, we were talking about the paper they're writing about monetizing cultural issues. That's getting close to danger zone, right? And what you're talking about, how do you control and protect? Wow. In the modern world, I suppose you patent things, right? Or you copyright things, but are Native communities going to want to copyright their songs, their symbols, their You know, the macaw and the Cholmondeley had a way to do that. They didn't need the United States Patent Office to do it. They had laws, no matter what Thomas Jefferson thought, that controlled the kind of issues you're talking about. I honestly don't know the answer to this. Once knowledge becomes well known, we know what big companies are doing. They're going through the Amazon rainforest, you know, trying to get Native people to point out valuable plants, and then they want to patent that stuff. So, is that what your question was more directed at, sir? How to preserve it in the... Because of the problem side of it. And perpetuated. Mm-hmm. Well, that goes a little bit to the comment I just gave to William. If a society wants to write this down, I mean, that's one way to preserve it, right? Maybe this doesn't want to be written down. Now it's a problem. But that's why a culture needs at least enough economic development, I can't think of a better word, but that people, that tribal historians, tribal shaman can do their work while they're supported by other people, just like Beethoven and Galileo, I guess. I don't know how you preserve that if you don't want to write it down. Then it's got to be an oral tradition that continues. I mean, at the Onondaga people, the Iroquois folks, I was kind of stunned to find out very recently that they still have 6-day religious ceremonies, and they recount their creation stories. So how do you have time to go to a 6-day ceremony? You need vacation time, right? I mean, just pure and simple. You got to have enough economic resources that you can do that. So, I mean, like I mentioned the comment, I'm glad the tribes have got to write their histories. That's the only thing scholarly world recognizes, right, is if it's written by someone with a PhD after their name or a JD after their name. So that, I don't know what to think about that. But if we're going to want our future generations to know it, we got to transmit it somehow. So you were talking about preserving or repatriating objects from, well, I was a little surprised to find out that Canada has not enacted a law like this, but in 1990, the United States Congress enacted the NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So I was surprised asking a few people on this trip that Canada has not ever enacted such a law. But we require any institution receiving federal monies in the United States to inventory and publicize their collections and try to reach the peoples where those objects come from. So my tribe has toured many museums and tried to get things back. And if the museum cannot prove that they legally purchased it, it can be repatriated. Uh-huh. Well, in the U.S., you can force the repatriation. So there are 4 categories: human remains, funerary objects, associated funerary objects, and sacred objects. And they're all identified or defined in this NAGPRA Act. And that's been a major issue. The museums fought this act big time because they were afraid their collections were going to be stripped. Now, it's not had near the impact that people worried about. But, I mean, I've been to the Field Museum in Chicago, and here's an empty display case, and there's a sign that says this object has been removed at the request of, like, an Alaskan tribe, the Tlingit and Haida. So a lot of their objects were removed because these were sacred things that shouldn't be seen. I guess the tribe didn't necessarily want it back, but they didn't want the museum showing it. So I'm just stunned if Canada doesn't have such a thing. So maybe you need to be advocating for such an act if that's where we're at here.
See, we're over time, so we'll just have one more quick question, and then we'll wrap it up and we're done.
Okay.
I'm not sure what my question is, but maybe if I talk, you can define my question.
I can divine it.
And then give it an answer. Not divine it, define, hopefully. Maybe you can divine it, and that would be much easier. You talked a lot about the entrepreneurship and happening on reserve and the things that happen with that. And in British Columbia, we have as many First Nations as the rest of Canada combined, and we don't have treaties with a lot of them. So as we move forward and are struggling with that, and the notions of reconciliation, which are in the forefront today, as opposed to what appeared to be assimilation 100 years ago, or the strategies looking at assimilation as opposed to looking at the notions of a reconciliation. So we're in the process with the federal government and the provincial government doing a lot of negotiating and creating treaties. So there are a number of treaties, which are a few treaties that have been approved over the past few years, and there are a number, I think it's 30 something of our First Nations who are in negotiations now. What insights would you have in terms of the entrepreneurship, the social innovation, and the economies of reserves in terms of how that might be interpreted or included or inform some of those negotiations that would help ensuring that we would see the type of growth and social and cultural and economic growth that we want to see happen on those reserves and indeed off those reserves? Are there things that you've learned or seen that might inform that? That might be my question, but it might be something else if you've defined it otherwise.
Else. Well, let me state something that I think most people aren't aware of. There are 565 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There's only 375 federal treaties with tribes. And quite a few tribes, such as my own, signed multiple treaties in the United States. So I dare say that 3/4 of the tribes in the United States never signed a treaty with the United States. I point to up here and go, wow, those people are doing better than we are because they're still signing treaties with the tribes in BC. We stopped signing treaties with tribes in 1871 by act of Congress. People debate what that means and what it meant. Whatever, I don't have time to get into that. But what could you do with treaties today? Well, what does BC want from the tribes? They want economic assets and benefit. What do the tribes want? Protect their homelands, but they need economic activity too. So I would hope and think, I know that one tribe was saying that they were going to demand the right to whale in the treaty they were still talking about with BC. And I think these were relatives of the Macaw. So after the Macaw did their successful whaling, their relatives up the coast wanted to get that right in writing. To my knowledge, no treaty yet. Don't know, But anyway, I would hope that tribal communities would be thinking, what can we do with BC? What can we do with Canada? We want our jurisdiction protected. We want our sovereignty protected. We need economic activity too. Can we work with, how do we share? How do we all, float all boats, right? Is that the old saying, raise all boats? So that's what I would hope along the line of your question. Economic activity is that those kind of issues are being addressed in these treaty-making sessions. I talked to someone last night, I forget, it was the guy from the Board of Trade who had been in charge of Kamloops. The tribe didn't have a fire department, and the tribe had to negotiate with Kamloops to get fire protection. I did some of that in the United States because to build tribal housing with federal funds, there had to be fire departments available. Well, our tribes didn't have a fire department. How do you get a fire department? You negotiate and you pay for it. So I involved myself a couple times. And so, that's just an example of the kind of things that hopefully tribal leaders are thinking about as they're talking with BC and what issues are trying to be settled. And economics should absolutely be on the table. In recent years.
And there's one initiative, the first model, about a decade ago.
Well, it's the reverse in the United States. We do not want to go to the federal courts anymore because we're losing in front of the U.S. Supreme Court all the time. Please? Repeat.
Maybe you need some of our lawyers.
Thanks.
I think that's a good point to leave on from one of our MLAs.
When he leaves the room, I want to talk to him.
All right, we'll talk to him.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, Robert, thank you very much for coming here and sharing your ideas. You've had 2 nights in a row. I think you've reached about 100 people both nights. I know people last night have benefited. I can see on a lot of the faces here that people have found it interesting and have benefited in some way. So I really appreciate each of you coming out. Thank you very much to William for the really great opening. Thank you for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you to President Petter, who is not here. Thank all of you for being here a few minutes late. Thank you for Professor Godalovich for creating this session on entrepreneurship. Thank you once again to Gladys. And Robert, just a small token of our appreciation, in addition to the image, to the tie that was given earlier, and the SFU Eagle print, that's our emblem of our Aboriginal Executive MBA. We have a small other present here as well too, so thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.